Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture in the Arts. Before we begin, I want to thank Kim and Judy Davis, whose support makes this lecture series possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity ensures that our events are free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, we're joined by the renowned contemporary artist, Fred Wilson, whose radical installation strategies challenge our assumptions and complicate prevailing historical and social narratives. Fred works in varied mediums, including sculpture, painting, and printmaking, and he engages with complex and profoundly important subjects, including race and racism, the history and legacy of slavery, and the power structures lurking in the collection, categorization, and display practices of museums. Fred has described the museum as his palette, and his work has reshaped how cultural institutions consider their collections and displays. In his groundbreaking 1992 exhibition, Mining the Museum, Fred rearranged and rejuxtaposed existing objects in the Maryland Historical Society's collections, including many items once left in storage. He did so to shine a spotlight on the ways museum exhibition practices leave the histories and legacies of racism untold. In one striking display, titled Metalwork 1793 to 1880, ornate sterling silver tea sets gleam alongside shackles, heavy and rusted, once used to chain enslaved people. The juxtaposition compels viewers to contemplate how the brutality of slavery was never far removed from the genteel lives of wealthy Americans, how the wealth that slavery generated supported the refined arts we're accustomed to seeing on display, and most importantly, how this history is or isn't told. In another display, Fred placed the Historical Society's busts of Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and Napoleon on three white pedestals, positioned across from three empty black ones. He labeled those empty pedestals Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Benjamin Banneker, for three African-American Marylanders critically important to American history, but overlooked by the Maryland Historical Society. To quote Fred, in the United States, museums are focused on white culture, so it was all about the absences. It's been nearly 3 decades since mining the museum, and Fred has continued to center overlooked histories in innovative and powerful ways. His most recent work, Afro Kismet, explores migration, history, and culture through the presence of Africans and people of African descent in Turkey. The work originally appeared at the 2017 Istanbul Biennial and has since been exhibited in London, New York, and Los Angeles. Fred has received numerous awards, including a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the Ford Foundation's Art of Change Fellowship, and Brandeis University's Creative Arts Awards. He represented the United States at the 1992 Cairo Biennale and the 2003 Venice Biennale, and his work has been featured in over 40 solo exhibitions and museums around the world. After Fred's remarks, he'll be joined in conversation by Cheryl Finley, who is the inaugural Distinguished Visiting Director at the Atlanta University Center's Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. Cheryl is also a Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College, an Associate Professor of Art History at Cornell University. She's the author of the award-winning book, Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon, and co-author of My Soul Has Grown Deep, Black Art from the American South. We're honored to have both Fred and Cheryl with us today. Following Fred and Cheryl's discussion, we'll turn to audience questions, and you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any point during the program. We ask that you please keep your questions brief so that we can address as many of them as possible. With that, let's begin. Welcome, Fred. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Truly appreciate being here, and thrilled that all of you wanted me to come and speak to you and have a great conversation. This image is one of my projects, which I called Guarded View. I'm going to try to skip and hop and go through a lot of different images. I show this because I was a guard when I was young at a museum, at my college museum, and it really kind of focused me on in a different way than I had been used to when I was at a museum, not from looking at the art, but looking at the people in the museum more than anything else. And it was really interesting because I was on display like all the other objects in the museum, but I was also invisible. And this combination really intrigued me, upset me, especially since in most museums, African Americans or brown people and from all across the country and other countries are in these jobs. And so what are they guarding? What narrative are they guarding? What do they have to stand with and know another truth about the things that they're guarding? So this is, it's from this vantage point I am speaking at this point. Next slide. This is, as was mentioned, this is the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore, Maryland, as it was when I first got there. And I felt very uncomfortable in the space and didn't know why. The first museum that I was asked to do a project with. And so I figured if I'm not feeling, it's a museum that I'm so familiar with, why do I feel this way? Let me explore that. Next slide. The painting that was in the center of the image, the last slide, was this one. And there are 5 children in the center of the painting. But if you lift the painting more fully, next slide, you would see that there are 7 children in the painting, 1 in the doorway, 1 on the floor. These children, this is a 19th century painting, these are slave children, and they were, playmates or pets for the children in the center of the painting. And, but you are not meant to see them. In fact, in another painting, the director of the museum said, I never noticed that black child there. And he walked by it every day. But you are not meant to see the black children in the painting. You're meant to be in the historical society to see the glories of America. And even though they were in the actual artwork, you were focused not to see them. I did many things, including have a group of black children stand in front of this painting and say to me what they thought the children were thinking. And they thought of the black children, where is my mother? Who calms me when I'm afraid? Who washes my back? Many things like that. And I made an audio tape so the voices would come off the painting to illuminate these children who are unnamed. Their names were not on the label, and give them a voice. And so the whole room, these voices were coming from the paintings, created by the words of children. Next image. But often, when I'm working on something, it's not always the same kind of way of reacting to it. This is a painting by Ernest Fisher, painted in 1850. It's called Country Life. However, people were not necessarily naming their paintings in 1850. So it could have been the collector that named it Country Life, the dealer, or the museum itself naming it Country Life. So I figured if it wasn't the artist naming it, I can name it too. So on the other side of the painting, next slide, I named it Frederick Serving Fruit. Just reorienting your view from just a slight change in the title changes the whole vantage point of how one thinks about this painting. Next image. And here, as was spoken about, was metalwork 1793 to 1880. These are repoussé silver objects, which I really thought were beautiful. But then in the ledger books, deeply buried were these slave shackles, which I put on view. Next image. Because whose hand serves the silver? Who could have made these silver objects in apprenticeship situations at the end of slavery, but certainly whose labor produced the wealth that could produce the silver. Next image. And I've in the cabinet making storage, these wonderful chairs, but then there was also this large object which was laying on the floor. And the curator said, I asked them what it was, and the curator said, oh, that's the public whipping post. They used that till 1958 in front of the city jail. We don't know what to do with that thing. Well, I had some ideas. Next image. This is North Carolina, a historic village. I was very excited to do a project in a historic village because I'd been to Colonial Williamsburg when I was a child and never really went back. And it's really a fascinating experience to sort of remember what you felt as a child when you're going through someplace like that. And I'm born New Yorker, so never experienced anything like that. But in the center of this painting is a church. It is a church. It's the home Moravian church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And the Moravians were a German-speaking Czech group who came to the United States for religious freedom in the 1600s. And yes, George Washington did sleep there, at least once. However, they were excited for me to come through. I walked around and they showed me all the buildings, very interesting buildings. And I asked them, were there any, Black people here? And it was only in my prompting that they bring up that, yes, there were some. They did not, in the early years, they did not have slavery. Whoever became there became part of the community of Moravians. But in my research, I believe that it's shifted as the Moravians became much more like the surrounding community. And that it was through the objects that I found. So I was looking for things to display and places to display. So I had people walking from building to building, and I had things displayed. Next slide. Here is a Bible and a whip, a leather Bible and a leather whip. The whip was for use on people, particularly slaves. So they didn't have many, but they did whip them anyway. And under the label, leather bound. Next slide. I was looking for buildings and they were all being used. So I saw this one and it seemed, derelict, seemed sort of not used, nobody cared about it. So I asked them, what is this building? Can I use it? They said, oh, that's the Black church. We use it for storage. So yeah, if you want to use it, go right ahead. And I said, yes, well, I do want to use it, in fact. But since it was the church, I wondered, after looking into the building, I wondered where were those beautiful white stones that were in front of the home Moravian church where people were buried? Because obviously there had been beautiful white stones in front of this building. And I wondered, where they were. And no one in the Old Salem could tell me where the stones were. So I looked myself. I looked behind the church. I looked inside the church. I looked in other buildings around, and the archives didn't mention where they were, where it happened to them. So I just went on my merry way because I wanted people to go from building to building. So I did this. Next image. I added these silhouettes in the locations where the burial locations would have been. The Black community would have to come through the bush across a stream to get to their church, which was on the right side of the image, on a hill. And the Black community still lives in that area, not necessarily Moravians, but they were still live in that area. So I asked them if any of them would pose for a silhouette. And they did, and these are all images of people who actually live in the neighboring neighborhood. So people would come in and they'd walk up the path to the door, and I was really getting anxious because I wanted to be able to talk about these stones and finding any information. So I looked in the attic, it wasn't there. There was a loose floorboard. I said, well, let's lift up the floor. Lift up the floor, next image. And there they were, just thrown into the church. No one had known that they were there. At least no one, that I spoke to the old Salem said they knew where they were. Some of them were piled up holding up the joists of the church. So this was all very embarrassing for the museum, of course. But on the other hand, they were very excited to have this discovery. At least some people were excited by having this discovery. Timothy, a native of Africa, Robert, Rose. These were all, I could research all these stones because there was voluminous information about the memorials when they died. So I had a picture of each one of these people whose names are on the stones and did a whole environment related to that. If you want to know what happened after I left, I will certainly tell you after. Next slide. Here I am standing looking at the SCAD Museum of Art. This is Savannah College of Arts Museum, a new museum down there when I got there. And it was built on an old railroad station. And it was to show contemporary art. And there was an African-American collector, Walter O. Evans, who lived there, and he donated a part of his collection of African-American art to this new museum. But as I was walking in the front door, the curator who invited me said to me, as we spoke about this new building, all built on an old building, she said, well, all these bricks are slave-made bricks. And apparently, many buildings in the city were made from the slave-made bricks. And this was a very profound thought and image for me. In fact, on one tour, I saw a building, and the tour would stop and show you a thumbprint in one of the bricks by one of the brick makers, so showing it was like he or she marked her that she was there. Anyway, this was a very unusual thing because I'll show you the next image. This is where they lived. They built their own homes on the plantation, and probably the warmest slave environment, slave home in all of the South. The winters were probably great. The summers were probably really hot. But anyway, they're made of the bricks that they themselves made. Next slide. So in my installation, of course, there was going to be lots of brick. The wall in the back, the arch is all the slave-made brick and a part of the structure of the building. The brick walls that you see right in front are average bricks. I just collected bricks from around the city. And what they're surrounding is some of the works from the collection of Walter O. Evans, given to by African-American artists. These are by, okay, of course, the name of the artist just escaped me, and it'll come back though. Surrounding these artworks, so you can see them or not see them, barely see them. Next image. Here is another work, this is by Aaron Douglas, Go Down Moses, and just intuiting it's an image to go with the bricks, to go with the image on the wall. Next slide. This is work by Richmond Barthé, African-American sculptor during the Harlem Renaissance, and surrounding it by this enclosure. On the backside, you see Robert O. Evans, the collector, also collected a voluminous archive of written material by every African-American of the early centuries that ever wrote or lived. And he just recently gave all of his papers, Frederick Douglass papers that he had, incredible things, to Yale. But at any rate, I had on the back side of this one, there was a text by James Baldwin that I felt went really well with this this emotional image here. Next. And snaking down inside the gallery were these bricks, and these are slave-made bricks, and one for every enslaved person who lived on that plantation. I tried to find out all their names, but it's been I was not able to do it within the time I was there. I hope somebody kind of does that research in Savannah. Next image. This is the exhibition as a whole. Next image. And so, anyway, I won't continue to talk about it, but this is more of the images with the bricks. And there was one other thing. Next slide. When I was at Walter O. Evans's home, looking at his archive, he had all of his archives in these beautifully bound black cases with gold writing of what was inside. And he had them spread out. He'd come in very excited that I was there doing this and bring things out that he loved, and showed me, would open these boxes and show me the letter from, Malcolm X, or a book, a first edition book by, you name it, whoever in African-American history, W.E.B. Du Bois or whoever, and he put it all on his table. So I sort of recreated this image, these caverns of books on the table. Next slide. However, I don't have the papers in these books. These are specially made books that have, each one contains a slave-made brick. So the weight of history is actually, you lift it and the weight of history is within it. Next image. This is Venice. This is the American Pavilion in Venice. And having done these projects in the States, and having been to Italy, I found it fascinating to think about the Africans of Italy. Next slide. Of course, in Italy, they don't think they have their immigration does not go back that far. That the Italians, that Africans coming to Venice, coming to Italy is a new idea, new thing. Well, it goes back way to before, probably the 12th century, but the 15th century for sure in all the art that I've seen, and certainly in Venice. This is by Veronese. If you, at this large table, you have African people either waiting or cooking or what have you. They also have Turks in the painting coming to this table by Veronese. I'm not going to get into the art history of the painting, but the fact that in all these paintings, these are not, as often people want to say, these are made up characters. No, these were people who were there. These painters did not make up these characters. They painted from life. Next slide. Here's a close-up of that. You see in the periphery on one side up the wall, you see an African man, and then by the stairway, there's another African boy there. Next image. This is by Carpaccio, who made this painting, and it's also in the Accademia Museum in Venice. Next slide. This black gondolieri, the gondolier driver, in almost importantly, in the front of the scene. Obviously, he was something that Carpaccio wanted to make you see because of his fine clothing, because of his difference. The painting is about a whole other subject elsewhere in the painting, but he is obviously there working in Venice, and for one of the wealthier families, as all the other gondolier drivers are. Again, no information about these figures from history anywhere to be found. So as an artist, all I can do is imagine and create from this imagination. Next. And Tiepolo did many paintings. However, in several, there's a black boy, and the black boy you see here in the lower right hand image. Next slide. And here is another black boy who was actually playing a Moor, which, you know, ironically, he was. Next slide. And this black boy. Now, all these are the same black boy. He just, I didn't order it in the way, unfortunately, I didn't order in the way of, you could see him getting older in the paintings as time went on. But this is another allegorical painting. However, in the painter is actually, gosh, my mind is, Tiepolo himself, and the woman who he's painting is his wife. And this boy, whose name was Ali, worked in his studio. And so, you know, the history of Africans in Europe goes really, really way, way back. And the artists are the ones who are the only ones who have captured this, these moments, this history in their work. But even still, they're invisible to the population because of everything else that is deemed important in the Venetian museums and in Venice. Next image. So back to the pavilion. There are things that I've done to the pavilion. Next image. Oh, I also made mannequins of the various black characters found in the paintings. And the pavilion, for some reason, has this glass wall on the side of it. And so I use this as a way to sort of you can view them from the outside and more almost looking like a clothing shop in, you know, in San Marco. Next image. And here's the painting that character at the far right of that other one was in. He's, I should say that this is an interesting because all those costumes I had remade out of silks and satins in you know, the fabric, historic fabric foundation called Ratti in Lake Como in Italy. And when I asked the person about the costume, she said, "What's a fantasy costume?" Of course it wasn't. It was a real costume, the real clothing of a West African person. Next image. And keep going. Next image. Next image. That's it. And here's someone looking at the display. Next. And these are not actual stone men. They are images from the Frati Church. These huge sculptures in the Frati Church of black men who were spoils of war against the Turks. The Venetians and the Turks have a long history of warring. Next image. They're actually scrims, not the actual things. Next image. And here's a photographs I made of these 4 characters. Next. And a chandelier. The first, I mean, it's not, the city is not a city of chandeliers, but it is a city of like historic buildings, historic environments that they're like museums. And so I decided to make a black chandelier, where there was the first one. They only had other images of in pastel colors, other chandeliers. And this was called Speak of Me As I Am. And it is the line from Othello, who was the most famous African in Venice that never lived. Next image. And there were these boys in front of the buildings, and I just changed them to represent the actual, sort of as a metaphor for the actual individuals who were there. This is called The Wanderer. Next. And here's one that I simply, next, took the pillow off his hands, and these pegs were where the pillow was, showing his pain. Next image. And here, I'm going to try to quickly talk about Istanbul, where I made these chandeliers. Next image. And found paintings in their storage rooms. The paintings, I asked them for paintings there was a black character in it, and like most museums, they would say, "Oh, we don't really have 1 or 2, but not that many." And this happened to me at the Met, which is something we could talk about. But But of course, I found many more than they had ever seen, because when you're not looking for something, you don't see it. And so here, in order to see it, I put an object, I put a blow up of the Black character within the scene to the right of it. And this is an image of the harem, again, a fantasy image, because the man who painted it was obviously not allowed to go into the harem. Next image. And the same here, really early painting. The next image. And yes, the next image. And here we have a chandelier, a combination of an Ottoman chandelier and a Venetian chandelier with title "The Way the Moon's in Love with the Dark," which is a line from one of Pushkin's poems, who he himself, his great-grandfather, as he would say, was stolen off the continent of Africa, brought to Turkey to be sold to the Sultan, and then the emissaries of Peter the Great either bought him or stole him and his brother and brought him to Russia. And so he's very proud of his great-grandfather, Hannibal. Next image, let's see if I can just get, next. And here is tile that I loved making. However, these are historic tile designs and historic colors, but when I wanted to put black as the background, the main guy in this tile factory said, no, you can't do that, you'll never see anything. But then here it is, very easy to see. Next image. With the words on this tile wall say, "Black is beautiful." And I have a lots more, but maybe we'll save that for another time. I should really introduce Cheryl Finley, the fabulous Cheryl Finley. I'm really curious as what her questions might be for me.
Thank you so much, the fabulous Fred Wilson. It's great to be here, and it's just so wonderful to see your work and to see the details that you've shared with us today. I think I want to begin, and I know you had a lot more to share with us, Fred, but I just wanted to begin with a couple of thoughts about the way that your work makes visible that which others cannot see, the way that you, I think as you said yourself, you give voice to the voiceless. And I wanted to ask if you could maybe share, especially with regards to the project that you just finished, Afro Kismet, some of what happened as you were working on the exhibition, as you were conducting research, and then as the exhibition actually comes to realization. What are the reactions, between the people who go to see it, who's allowed to see it, who has access to the actual installation itself, and then what are the differences between having it installed in Turkey, say, versus a traveling version around the United States?
Mm-hmm. Well, this was like no other project I've done, because when I got there, I didn't know what I was going to work on. However, I was told that I'd see Africans walking around Istanbul, and I assumed they were immigrants, but it turns out they are not immigrants. They have been there for several hundred years. Africans have been in Turkey for several hundred years. Obviously, came through the slave trade of the 18th century and 19th century. And of course, as earlier, there are many Europeans who came to Turkey via the slave trade in the earlier centuries. But these families still there. It wasn't until kind of this new awakening of the global African that they themselves have kind of been able to place themselves in a larger context. So they are totally misunderstood within their own country, and only now are some of the stereotypes, which I was going to show you, have been abandoned. But they're still there. I have all these great weird stories from people, and so I got to talk to them, as opposed to Venice, where it was just a complete imagination. I got a group of them came to meet me before I started this project, and they talked about what it was like to be there and what their lives were like. and sometimes speaking perfect Turkish would flummox the Turkish nationals. So because they couldn't understand that they'd been there, they were Turkish. The blacks were Turkish, and so it was interesting because of that. Because it was the first time I could talk to a community about their lives there, so I could weave into this project the reality for the Afro-Turks, as they're called, or Afro-Armenians, or Afro-Greeks, or Afro-Kurds, who are also were swept up into the are part of the empire of the Turkish Empire, about their lives. So there was a combination of contemporary and also historic combining, which was an education for not only in certain ways the Afro-Turks, but for the entire Turkish community, and embarrassed some of them that they didn't know, and the things that they foolishly would say without knowing. The Afro-Turks that I knew came to see the show. The larger population is Izmir, which is not in Istanbul. So the audience for it was largely the kind of average Turk coming to, and into the international community coming to see this Biennale. Hopefully it did, stretch people's minds about the whole subject.
I think by all accounts, it most definitely did. And I thought another question that's related is going back to Venice, and to talking about the populations that you were addressing there. And maybe I'm interested in a couple of different things. I enjoyed that exhibition. I remember going in and out, so many times in 2003 when it opened. And there was this moment where I think that there was a contemporary involvement, if you will, of the police in Venice, right? And so I wanted you to maybe speak about that, just in terms of them understanding. And this kind of gets to, the way that you're uncovering and revealing these histories that are in plain sight of people who actually live and are part of a community. I think that your work is very much about community building, as it is also about doing the kind of deep research you do in the archives.
Mm-hmm. Well, the guy who was guarding the handbags were made from the fabric of the remnants from these great beautiful silks and satins from the costumes that I made, and the Carabinieri. This is during the vernissage. I was in the building meeting guests, but apparently the Carabinieri, the police, came and tried to take all them away for being out there selling these things, and until it had to be explained that he was, working for me as to sort of protect these things, and of course part of the project in total. So they have, it also revealed some of the issues for the contemporary. The contemporary Italians, the contemporary folks who came from Africa to find a home in Italy. Luckily nothing came to that because he was there working with me. But in fact, he was just a visitor. He has his friends who were the others who were actually living there. But they have a difficult time of it too. They would tell me that when they go to a club, the younger guys go to a club, they'd have to say they were American because they spoke several languages, unlike the Italians. So they would say they were Americans, and then they would let them in. But if they said they were Senegalese, they would have a hard time getting in. So these things. So the whole point is to sort of reveal that we're much closer together and much more involved with each other than one would ever imagine.
Absolutely. And I love the globe behind you and the image of the globe and the world and this idea of a global citizen that your work often tends to. I also wanted to ask, though, just in terms of your practice and, not only the research that you do, but also I think the way in which you often even pioneer new forms of research, new forms of engaging with archives and with museums, with cultural institutions, and even with something that is, age old, like glass blowing. I'd like to hear something more about the Black chandelier.
Mhm.
And, just if you could talk about that, as a process and the kind of statement that you're making to make a chandelier, something that's meant to be opulent and to project light
Mhm.
out of black,
Right.
beautiful black.
Exactly. And it really came to me as the absolute metaphor for for Othello, that first one. I continue making them and twisting the idea and turning it around. But yeah, I mean, it was spindly like kind of a skeletal form, uh, but it was huge and beautiful, and mournful also, and which to me was really a very good description of Othello himself. And I continue with these projects because it's become a metaphor for other things for me, um, about blackness. The one goes from white at the top to black at the bottom, and it really was it was about death. I had created it, and soon after realized my father was dying. Well, at the point where this was being, I was thinking about this and this sculpture, and just saw it as his blackness, his kind of soul going down and something rising up. So it's all, these things come to me, and it becomes important. The other thing is that by doing the Black Chandelier in Venice, it was not only like Othello, but like all of us who travel and don't look like anybody else in that particular place, and so it gives you so I sort of see myself in it as well when my hair was black, uh, but um, that these things are like stand-ins for us, wherever they appear and occur. Um,
Right, absolutely. So I wanted to think a little bit about maybe what you're working on now, and I'd like to ask a question about collaboration. If you wanted to collaborate with anyone who is working in the arts today, whose work addresses history, memory, and the archive, who would that be?
well, now you really got me. To a specific person, I'm not quite sure. I used to. I mean, when I was in college, I was an art student, but I also uh, took dance and whatever was out there to try something new, and so I would not mind working with a choreographer, you know,
Mhm.
in doing something with a choreographer like Ralph Lemon, or someone, uh, uh, to kind of sort of have our 3D experience, both as a body in space and other kinds of bodies, created bodies in other materials,
Right.
like bodies.
It adds movement, but also a certain time-based element to the work that you do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
beautiful, beautiful. So I also wanted to maybe just reflect on, the current moment, the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic, and ask you if you have any advice for arts and culture institutions, if you have advice for even our students in response to these pressing issues and pressing times.
um, I think the most important thing to do is to express your true self. Obviously, it doesn't, in the whatever your gift or your way of doing it is, to keep you going, keeping you moving forward. Moving forward is the most important thing, and then also imparting your perspective in on the world in your best way, and in a way that will draw people in to sort of understand what you're feeling, rather than repel them. and by giving the most basic, your most strongest and basic instincts and love and compassion, and in the most profound way, so that you're also nurtured by that, rather than just throwing out something that is so desperately hard for your own body, let alone anybody else. It's if you can sustain your beautiful thoughts, and also your most heartfelt thoughts in relation to the difficult issues that we are living a part of. Well, some of us all our lives, and also the depths of despair with this pandemic, where I don't doubt anyone doesn't know anyone who has passed from this pandemic, but to just completely show your humanity through your creativity or your intellect, and connect, so that we all can grow from it and see the truth of things, because we are being so real in our way of speaking to the world.
Fred, hi. I'm sorry, we just had a power outage, so let me see if I can get past that. I like to maybe get to some of the questions, because we have a lot of people who are with us today and also eager to ask questions. So I wanted to begin with one of the early questions that is about your show at the Maryland Historical Society. And the question is, how did you receive an invitation from the Maryland Historical Society to do your first museum exhibition there?
Well, this was by a curator named Lisa Curran. She and the director of their Museum Without Walls in Baltimore, George Sissel, had seen some of my installations in galleries that looked like museum spaces, the early things that I did. I never expected to work with a museum. I just was critiquing them. And they were in Baltimore. They had lots of connections in Baltimore, where they did projects in bus stations and communities and such. So they thought, well, what if Fred got a real museum? So that's how that started. I went and interviewed all these museums in Baltimore. I don't know if they really knew what I was there doing, but I was interviewing them to see if I wanted to work with them. And the Historical Society was probably the museum that thought the least about museum display, And so I thought this was and also I felt really uncomfortable in that place. And I thought, well, let me just explore why I feel so uncomfortable in this place, because it's not images that I'm not used to seeing. But I think for me, denial is a very strong prompter of making work. If I find there's a kind of a denial involved in the environment that I'm in.
Absolutely, and I think also, to your point, it's really the case that you can often feel that it's a physical reaction to the space, to just being in the space, whether it's a museum or whether it's in historical site itself, you can actually feel that. And when I think about the type of extra, really labor and probing that you did when you were in North Carolina to really get at the root of where were those headstones.
Yes.
That's another example of really trying to find, what is the truth? What is the truth telling that you are participating in? So there's another question here that asks.
I just should say before that I went back in recent times to North Carolina, and nothing is happening. It's sort of, I left, there was a couple of people who sort of took the mantle, but the rest of the Old Salem was not particularly interested. They made a little building, they put some of the stones in the building, but really, you'd think from that first experience, they would really sort of make that part of their environment, but they haven't.
Well, that's unfortunate, because the question that I was going to ask was what happened at that site after you left.
And this is why, I'm glad you asked it, and this is why I want to bring it up, because, if you're ever in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, visit and see and ask about it, because that's the only way things happen, really.
Mm-hmm. So there's another question that asks something of your practice prior to mining the museum. What kind of work were you making before mining the museum? Was mining the museum a turn in your practice toward curatorial moves, or had these impulses come up before?
I have been angry at museums. I'm no longer angry because I get to speak. I get to do all this, so I'm not angry anymore. But I would go to museums and see exhibitions and read labels and such, and you realize they're not talking to me. No matter if it's about some other subject or me, they are not talking to me and my community, or anybody else besides a very small group of people, often in the past, and not even the general public. And so I would get angry because they would get things wrong. They'd make assumptions, and they had no idea that they were doing that. And so my early projects were in galleries, in nonprofit galleries, and with the same kind of ideas, but my objects that I would collect, and it would be a museum space that would be the environment for these objects to kind of make different narratives and sort of present it so you would see that the museum is doing something and not thinking about these other issues. And that's what I did for the many years prior to, because I ran a gallery in the South Bronx when I first, one of the first in the 80s. And then I worked, downtown in other galleries, in the nonprofit gallery with just above Midtown, this nonprofit gallery, when there were nonprofit galleries. And so I was able to sort of think about museum display. I sort of grew up in the Met base, essentially, because I'm a New Yorker, and very aware of how museums create narratives and who they're talking to, who they're not talking to, just from my childhood experience of being in museums.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up in New York, seeing Spiral Group picketing in front of the Met because of Harlem on My Mind, which I went to with my father, who grew up in Harlem, and which he liked the show because it was the images, but there were no artist's works in the show besides Vanderzee, these were these big blow-ups of his photographs. And what's that?
It was like a photo installation.
Yes, it was like a photo installation, and it was great to see. But there was this big missing piece as an artist, and so there were a lot of things like those aha moments for me. And then when I was young.
Mm-hmm. So there's one other question I wanted to bring up from the Q&A, and it's about a proposed exhibition installation in Indianapolis. If you could talk about the proposed E Pluribus Unum and your thoughts on how that situation unfolded. Such a missed opportunity for the city.
Well, public art is a tough one. When I make a project within an institution, the institution, I talk to everyone in the institution, get their perspective, talk to people from outside, outside the institution who might be an audience for it. And it's from all these conversations that I make a work. However, when you're working in the public, anyway, I can't do anything about that. So when you're doing something in the public, I spent many years talking to various people in the Black community, as many people as who would talk to me. I talked to them about what I do, but still with public art, just one or two people can take down something in the public, can keep it from happening, because it has to be something for that everyone is on board for. And there are people who didn't speak to me on purpose because I was an outsider to Indianapolis, and so I didn't realize that until after the whole project was fully formed and coming down the pike, that the whole thing
they press pause.
Yeah, and so you kind of, it was painful after 5 years of working on it, but you know, I have to understand it's a public environment.
Right. Well, I wonder what they might be thinking now with all the attention to monuments and
Mm.
iconoclasm, you know, whether or not this is something they need to revisit. I have one more question, time for one more question from our attendees. And this is a question that asks if you had the opportunity to engage with Les Modèles Noirs at the Musée d'Orsay in 2019, or the version in New York City, at Columbia. This is Denise Murrell's exhibition.
And unfortunately, I saw neither project, which is so unfortunate. I just it was right up my alley, and did not get to see it, see either of them. Just place in time, wrong place, wrong time. And so, but it was from what I've seen in the catalog and, you know, what I know of it, it was a terrific turning point. These things can be turning points and aha moments for people who either think deeply about these things and never thought they'd see this together, or who never thought about it at all. And it's like, oh, and that's what museum exhibitions can do. They have a huge power as a communicator, as an emotional trigger, and museums rarely deal with that, because I don't blame the curators. The curators are trained in a particular way, not, you know, and then they're thrust into the environment of their scholarship is in a living environment. It's not in a book. It's in an environment where people move around and bring to it and take from it what they will. But you have a great opportunity to get various levels of information and emotion and history all together at a moment, and make people think, because they're so focused on that particular exhibition. So
right, it's also about, you know, real time, having to engage with it in real time.
that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much, Fred. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you and to hear you share your work with us for this past hour. And I look forward to future conversations. And it's my pleasure now to turn the floor back over to Dean Brown-Nagin.
Great.
Thank you.
Good to see
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, Fred and Cheryl, for this truly fascinating and important program. And of course, I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon and for all of your excellent questions. I hope you'll join us again soon, and you can find more information about our upcoming programs on our website. Have a great evening.